So what we're going to talk about next is how to handle positives and negatives of a property. First of all, we're going to talk about a negative. The negative of this property is that a certain portion above the front door of what is called the fascia board, which is the board that runs down from the eave of the house, about 6 inches, is rotted. And it's rotted in an area of about 4 feet. In the buyer, when they get out of the car, they're obviously going to see that, right? They had told me that they wanted a turnkey operation. Turnkey operation meaning I don't want to have to make any repairs. All I want to do is move in and just no repairs whatsoever. Now, normally, most associates, I should say, would say to the buyer, Mr. Buyer, there is something about this house that I need to tell you about. A little portion of the front eave of the house, the fascia board, is rotted. Wouldn't get the seller to fix it or put it into the contract that they'll fix it before we before we present the contract. Now, that would be one way to do it. But what if you said this to the buyer? Or, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I know you mentioned that you wanted a turnkey home with no repairs to be made. This next house I'm going to show you, in fact, it's right down the street that we're going to be looking at. I have to tell you that the front of the house needs work. Now, did I make that sound minor or major? You see, before, when I said there's a little piece above the door that you're going to see and we can get the seller to fix it, I made it sound minor. Here, to a certain degree, I'm making it sound major. Now, don't blow this out of proportion. But by making it sound major, what you're allowing the buyer to do is diminish its importance. The moment they get out of the car, they're looking at the front of the house thinking it's going to cave in. And they're looking at it going, well, what are you talking about? Oh, it's just that board above the front door. We can get the seller to fix it before the closing. And all of a sudden, it doesn't matter. So the way to handle a negative is to overstate a negative. And again, do this within reason. But overstate a negative, thus allowing the buyer to diminish the importance. Now let's talk about a positive. The positive is that the buyer has told us that their pet passion, the husband's pet passion, is shooting pool. And the next house has an antique pool table in it that the seller is leaving as an enticement for the buyer to buy. Now, this is not in the MLS brochure that the buyer has because the seller just decided to leave it last night. And when I called the broker to make the appointment, the broker told me that they're going to leave this antique pool table. So the question is, how do you handle this? Well, most people would say, by the way, Mr. Buyer, this next house, I know you love to shoot pool, and there's a pool table in this house, and it goes with the house. Okay, that's one way of doing it. But in what I'm about to tell you to do or can't do, you can't do this all the time. But when I show a property, I don't show a property. Now, what I mean by that is that I don't walk around the house with the buyers. Would you agree with me that if two people, husband and wife, are in a room and looking around the room, they will both have their own opinions, and they may be differing opinions. Well, if I'm standing there, they're not going to open up to me. They're not going to talk. They're not going to communicate. But if I'm not standing with them, then in turn, they will communicate. And by the time they come back to me, then they're of one mind. So what I'll say to them is something along the lines of this. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I'm going to work up some numbers here. Why don't you go ahead and take a look at the house, and I'll be right with you. I'll catch up with you in just a moment. All right, now, remember the husband loves to shoot pool. So he goes into that room, and he sees that pool table. Now, up to this point, I have not mentioned it. I haven't said a word about it. And he comes back out, and he says, did you know this house had a pool table in it? Oh, my God, I forgot to tell you. That goes with the house. Guess what? That guy just bought a pool table. The house is a bonus. Don't kid yourself. People don't buy houses. They don't buy bricks and mortar. They buy romance, prestige, safety for the family. Again, even ego and status come into play. They buy for a lot of reasons, but very rarely is it because it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath in this neighborhood and so on. I showed property to a couple one time. This was, I first of all did not see the property in advance. They found the property and wanted me to show it to them, and so I took them out. And I had never been in this house. And this couple was kind of odd because I couldn't do what I just described to you here. and that was that I let them wander through the property. And by the way, you can't do that if they're kids, and you can't do it if you don't know the couple. But if you trust them enough to do it, that's the way I always do it. But in any case, this couple, the reason I couldn't do this is the moment they walked into a house, they separated. The husband went walking through the house, and the wife went every time went from the front door to the kitchen. And so this time it was, I would go with the husband one time and the wife the next. This time it was the wife's turn. So I went with the wife. I want you to picture a kitchen that is at least 20 by 20, 20 by 25, huge, huge kitchen. There are 2 island consoles in this kitchen. It almost looked like a kitchen in a restaurant. And in turn, around all 4 walls, from the cabinets coming down to the counters coming up, there were doors. And there was one door after another, after another, after another, after another. And she walked into the room and she goes, looking at the doors, going, what is that? What are all those doors? And I said, I don't know. I haven't seen the house before. She walked over to one of the doors and she pushed a button. The door opened automatically, and hydraulically on a shelf, out came an appliance. She pushed every door, opened every one of them. Every one opened. There were at least, and this is not an exaggeration, there were at least 3 to 4 of every kind of appliance you could ever use in a kitchen. So because the kitchen was so large, you didn't have to move more than 2 to 3 feet to get to what you needed. So all of these doors are open, all of these drawers are out with all these appliances, and the husband walks into the kitchen. And she goes, look at this. And he's looking around the kitchen. He sees all the appliances and says, okay. She goes, no, 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 watch this. And she walks over to one of the doors. She closes the door, pushes the drawer back in, and closes the door. She pushes the button. It opens up automatically. Out comes the appliance. And she goes to her husband, isn't that neat? And he goes, okay. And she said, did you like the rest of the house? Yeah, I like it. It's nice. Let's buy it. This couple signed the contract in the kitchen, and the wife had never set foot in any other part of the house except for the front door to the kitchen. Did she buy a house or did she buy a kitchen? I bought a house one time. When I walked into it, I was moving from Miami up to Fort Lauderdale, and I saw a for sale by owner in the area that I wanted to work. And I wasn't going on a listing presentation, but I wanted to see what this person was offering. And I walked into this house, and there was a room. There was no furniture in the room. But I looked at it, and I asked the owner of the house, do you have a tape measure? And I measured the room. And the room was 14 by 16. I bought that house. If I had a live audience right now, a question I'd ask you is, do you know what a 14 by 16 room is good for? And the answer is a pool table. I do love to shoot pool. I've shot it since I was a small kid. And I've always told myself, one day, you're going to get a pool table in your house. When I walked into that house, I could see that pool table sitting there. I could see it. I didn't buy the house. I bought the pool table. I bought the house to put the pool table in. I put it in. I didn't use it that much, but I did put it in. But in any case, people don't buy bricks and mortar. They buy certain key things. But positives, you need to find out exactly what those hot buttons are. Now let's move on to another topic, and that is positive momentum questions. Now, positive momentum question, by definition, is a positive statement of fact followed by a question. Now, normally, when you phrase a question, you would say to a person, wouldn't it be great to go to dinner tonight? Well, instead of saying that, positive momentum dictates you'd say, it would be great to go to dinner tonight, wouldn't it? Now, if you'll notice at the first one, I put the words, wouldn't it, at the beginning. That created the question. The rest of the verbiage is just a statement, go to dinner tonight. By using positive momentum, you're reversing it and putting the words that create the question at the end of the statement. Now, the key to this is that the statement you're making is positive to the person you're talking to. And if it is positive to the person you're talking to, then what you're forcing that person to do is answer you in the affirmative, to verbalize an answer in the affirmative. Now, let's use positive momentum questions with a buyer. Let's say that we know that the buyer's world centers on their children. So you might say something like, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I'm sure you noticed when we drove up to the home that it was on a cul-de-sac, but did you also notice that there was a street light right out in front? That'll be great for the kids, won't it? You see, you've qualified the buyer. You've got inside their head. You know what they're looking for. You know their hot points. You know what their buzzwords are, the things that they need. And all of a sudden, you're forcing them to recognize the fact that this property meets one of those needs. Now, let's do it again. And this is an entirely different need. Let's say you know that the husband is status conscious. He's got a big ego. And so you're standing in the master suite and looking out to an enormous screen patio, built-in barbecue, the whole works, right? Pool, everything. So you might say to them, Mr. Johnson, can you imagine throwing a party out there? That'd be great, won't it? Now, notice in both cases that the question that I stated a fact, the cul-de-sac, the street light, I stated the fact throwing a party, but notice that I ended it in both cases with, that'll be great, won't it? And that's all you have to remember, those words, that'll be great, won't it? Now, the same concept works equally well with a buyer, and it also works equally well on the phone. As an example, you might be calling a seller to make an appointment and say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I saw your ad in this morning's paper, and I was wondering if you're cooperating with brokers. And the seller says, no, we're going to sell it ourselves. And do you mean that if I found a buyer for you at your price and terms, you wouldn't want me to show your property? Well, the answer to that's going to be, well, yes, but we're not listing. Okay, now I say that again. Are you cooperating with brokers? And the seller, what do you mean by cooperating? By that, I mean that if I found a buyer for you at your price and terms, you would want me to show your property, wouldn't you? Positive momentum. Positive statement of fact followed by a question. It's unfortunate, but this is an extremely difficult technique to learn because it is exactly the opposite of the way we normally voice a question. Normally, when we phrase a question, the words that create the question are always at the beginning. So to learn this technique, and by the way, this is in the Western world. In some parts of the world, this is the normal way to ask a question, to put the words at the end. But in our society, it's always at the beginning. So what you need to do is study this, practice it. And you need to do it with your friends, just general conversation. There's never going to be a point where you say to yourself, right now, okay, I'm going to use a positive momentum question. It just doesn't work that way. You've got to really train yourself to use it. Once you start doing that, it's going to work, won't it?